My name is Afshin, and the greatest truth in my life has always been my mother, Dr. Tayyiba. She was a woman whose reputation for kindness was as strong as her quiet resilience. Since the death of my father, which occurred so long ago that even his smile in the old photographs has faded into a blur in my memory, she had become my entire world. We lived in a modest neighborhood within a small city where everyone knew each other not just by names, but by ties of trust and unspoken understanding. In this tight knit community, my mother was recognized not only as a widow raising her only daughter, but as a woman determined to make her knowledge of medicine serve others, even when life refused to make the path easy. Despite holding a medical degree, she struggled to find employment. There were no large hospitals nearby, and clinics in the city were reluctant to take her on, either due to bureaucracy or their preference for more established doctors. For a long time, she worked silently at home, her books stacked high, her medical notes scattered across the table, her hope flickering but never extinguishing. Then one day, she made a decision that altered both our lives. She transformed part of our home into a small clinic. It was a bold step, one that required courage, savings, and the willingness to face the judgment of neighbors who doubted whether such a venture could survive. At first, the clinic's door remained closed more often than it opened. A whole day could pass with only one or two women arriving for consultations. My mother treated them with extraordinary patience, listening carefully, prescribing carefully measured treatments, and comforting them with words that carried warmth. Yet I could see the quiet disappointment in her eyes each evening. After the patients left, she would sit at the table with a tired smile, shuffling through the files as if searching between the lines for a solution she could not find. I would return from university to find her silent, her hand gently stroking my hair, her own emotions locked away behind a veil of restraint. I believed her sadness was the result of professional disappointment, that her brilliance as a doctor was being wasted in such a small space with so few patients. But she never complained. Instead, she kept her silence, her dignity, and her determination. It was during one such evening that she finally looked at me and said, "Afshin, would you sit for a while at the reception desk? It would be such a help to me." I was taken aback, for she had never before asked me to be part of her work, but I agreed without hesitation. I did not know it then, but this small request would mark the beginning of a journey that would unravel the hidden layers of both her clinic and her soul. From the very next day, my routine shifted. After returning from university, I would sit at the reception desk of the small clinic, recording names, arranging appointments, and occasionally preparing the medicine packets my mother asked me to hand out. At first, I thought of it as a simple act of support, something that would ease her burden. Yet within days, I noticed a change that was impossible to ignore. The clinic, once quiet and almost deserted, began to stir with life. At first, it was just one or two new patients trickling in, then 5, then 10. Before long, there were lines of women waiting outside our modest home, hoping to be seen by the doctor they called kind and attentive. I watched in amazement as the empty afternoons transformed into bustling hours, filled with footsteps, murmurs, and conversations in the waiting area. The once still room now carried the sound of life, of people searching for relief, of hope in the form of small prescription slips. And with this new energy, my mother seemed to transform. Her eyes, which once held shadows of fatigue, now carried a glow I hadn't seen since childhood. She worked tirelessly, moving from patient to patient, her white coat rustling softly as she leaned down to listen, to reassure, to prescribe. At night, she would come into the kitchen with a lightness in her step, preparing dinner with enthusiasm, asking about my studies, and smiling more often. For a while, it seemed as though her dream had finally taken root, but deep inside me, an uneasiness grew, though I could not name it. Something about the rapid transformation felt strange. Some of the women began returning repeatedly, sometimes after only 2 or 3 days, despite my mother assuring them that their treatments were completed. When I asked her why, she would respond vaguely, saying that illnesses could linger, or that patients sometimes needed reassurance more than medicine. I wanted to believe her. She was my mother, my guide, the only family I had. And yet, questions began to whisper inside me like faint echoes in an empty room. There were other things that unsettled me. Occasionally, she would take certain patients into a back room and lock the door behind her. Hours would pass before they emerged. She also insisted on fetching specific medicines from a separate room, rather than from the visible cabinet near my desk. I told myself these were just routines, small peculiarities of her practice. But in the quiet of the night, when I lay staring at the ceiling, I wondered if there was more to her work than I understood. Still, I silenced those doubts, for now what mattered was her happiness. Seeing her smile again, seeing her clinic alive with people, filled me with pride. I convinced myself that any unease in my heart was simply the result of overthinking. Yet, even as I reassured myself, I could not shake the faint, persistent thought, what if there was something behind her locked doors that I was not meant to see? Days slipped into weeks, and the rhythm of the clinic became the rhythm of my life. The waiting room rarely sat empty, and the lines of women seemed endless, each carrying her own story, her own pain. My mother was at the center of it all, respected, admired, and sought after. She carried herself with quiet confidence, her white coat almost a shield, her stethoscope like a crown. For the first time in years, I saw her moving with purpose, as though she had finally claimed the place the world had long denied her. Yet, the longer I sat at that reception desk, the more I began to notice the patterns that troubled me. Certain women appeared again and again. They would smile politely as I checked their names against the registry, but their eyes carried something unspoken: hesitation, worry, even fear. They would disappear into the consultation room, the door closing firmly behind them. Sometimes, the session would end quickly. Other times, the door would remain locked for an hour or more. When they emerged, their expressions were often unreadable. Some relieved, others pale and shaken. One afternoon, as I gathered files left on the table, I caught a glimpse through the slowly closing door. In that brief moment, I saw something that unsettled me. A black box placed on the floor inside, sleek and unmarked, unlike any piece of medical equipment I had seen before. I blinked, and the door clicked shut. My mother's voice followed. "Afshin, make sure the next patient is ready." Her tone was calm, as though nothing were out of the ordinary. But the image of that box lodged itself firmly in my mind. At night, I replayed the scene in my head, imagining what it could hold: specialized instruments, rare medicines, or something else altogether. Every possibility made my chest tighten. My mother had always been my compass of morality and truth, the woman who taught me to hold honesty above all else. How could I allow myself to doubt her now? And yet, the doubt was there, growing quietly, no matter how I tried to silence it. The unease only deepened when I began overhearing fragments of patient complaints. The medicine worked, but only for a day. I felt fine at first. Then the pain came back worse than before. I can't stop coming here. I feel like my body is breaking. Whenever these whispers reached my ears, my mother would simply write another prescription, repeating the treatment as if nothing was unusual. I told myself I was being paranoid, that my loyalty to her should outweigh every flicker of suspicion. But beneath the surface, a truth was beginning to stir. An invisible thread pulling me closer to something hidden, something my mother never wanted me to discover. The more I tried to dismiss my doubts, the more they clung to me, like shadows that refused to fade with daylight. I had grown up believing my mother was the embodiment of virtue, a woman who had sacrificed everything to raise me. To even entertain the thought that something might be wrong in her clinic felt like betrayal. Yet each day at the reception, my eyes involuntarily drifted toward that locked door at the back. It became the silent presence in the room, a question that hung in the air but was never spoken. One evening, while I was arranging patient files, I overheard two women whispering. They spoke in hushed tones, their voices low but tense. "Her medicine worked for a week, then I felt worse than before," one said. The other added, "It's the same for me, but when I told her, she only gave me the same pills again." They exchanged worried glances before leaving, unaware that their words had pierced me deeply. I wanted to run to my mother and demand an explanation, but the thought of doubting her out loud made my throat tighten. Soon after, I noticed another peculiar detail. Some of the medicine wasn't stored in the cabinet near my desk. Instead, my mother fetched it personally from the back room. She would disappear inside with her key, re-emerge minutes later carrying a small packet and hand it to the patient without a word. Her movements were precise, practiced, almost secretive. I tried to convince myself that these were rare treatments she kept separately, but the silence with which she handled them told a different story. The moment that cemented my suspicion came late one night. I had woken unexpectedly, unable to sleep. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed a faint glow seeping from beneath the door of the locked room. My heart pounded as I crept closer, the old floorboards creaking softly beneath my feet. Through the small gap of the doorframe, I saw her silhouette, my mother, moving slowly inside. In her hands, she held a white bag, which she placed carefully inside the black box. Then, as though sensing the weight of her own actions, she lingered for a moment before shutting off the light and locking the door again. I retreated silently, my back pressed against the wall, my chest heaving with confusion. What was in that bag? Why was it hidden away in secrecy? When she walked past me moments later, heading to her room, her face was calm, serene even, as if nothing unusual had happened. That night, I lay awake with a single thought circling endlessly in my mind. If my mother was hiding something, then perhaps the woman I thought I knew, the woman I trusted beyond question, was not the same woman who stood behind that locked door. From that night onward, the image of my mother slipping into the locked room with the white bag refused to leave my thoughts. It clung to me during lectures at the university, haunted me at the reception desk, and echoed in the silence of my bedroom. The more I tried to bury it, the stronger it returned, whispering at the edges of my mind, "Find out what's inside." At first, I tried to convince myself that my curiosity was misplaced. After all, my mother had always been my anchor, the kindest, most selfless woman I knew. But with every patient who left with the same medicine, every complaint murmured under breath, every locked door that separated me from the truth, my resolve began to harden. I knew that if I did not seek answers, I would forever live in doubt. The opportunity came sooner than I expected. A relative's wedding was being held in another city, and my mother was invited. She urged me to join her, but I insisted on staying behind, using the clinic as my excuse. "The patients need continuity," I said with a smile. She looked at me with pride, praising my sense of responsibility, unaware of the storm building within me. The morning she left, I sat restlessly in the reception area, staring at the door at the back. Hours passed before I finally rose to my feet, my hands trembling as I walked toward it. For a moment, I stood frozen, heart pounding so loudly I thought it might betray me. Then, remembering how my mother sometimes slipped her keys behind a cabinet when busy, I reached behind the wooden shelf. My fingers brushed against cool metal. She had hidden it there, just as I hoped. With shaky hands, I inserted the key into the lock. The sound of the click felt like thunder in the silence. Slowly, I pushed the door open. A rush of air greeted me, thick with the scent of chemicals and dampness. My stomach knotted as I stepped inside. The room was dim, lit only by a sliver of daylight creeping through a small window. To my right stood a tall glass cabinet filled with bottles of various sizes, their labels scrawled in a foreign language I couldn't decipher. On a steel table lay syringes, blister packs of pills, and instruments that looked more industrial than medical. But what truly unsettled me was a notebook lying in the corner. I opened it with trembling hands. Inside were patient names, illnesses, and notes, scribbled in my mother's handwriting. At first, it looked like routine records, but beneath each entry, a phrase repeated over and over. Initial relief, worsening after 7 days. My breath caught in my throat. Page after page revealed the same pattern. The medicines worked briefly, then left the patients worse than before. I staggered back, clutching the notebook to my chest. My mother, my kind, selfless mother, was keeping a secret that could no longer be ignored. I sat alone in the reception, the notebook still pressed against my chest as though it might burn a hole through me. The words "worsening after 7 days" echoed in my head like a curse. I wanted to believe there was another explanation. Perhaps these notes were part of a study. Or maybe my mother was recording a peculiar side effect with the intention of finding a cure. But deep down, I felt the truth tugging at me with merciless clarity. Still, doubt is a dangerous companion. It makes you waver between loyalty and suspicion, between love and fear. I decided I could not confront her yet, not without more proof. My mind turned to the bottles on the shelves, their labels marked in a script I barely recognized. I carefully slipped 2 of them into my bag, along with a strip of capsules I had found loose on the table. Then, snapping photos of several notebook pages, I locked the room and returned the key to its hiding place, determined to act as if nothing had changed. That evening, the clinic was busier than ever. The waiting room buzzed with women whispering to one another, each clutching prescriptions and hoping for relief. I forced myself to watch them closely, noting how often they returned, how many looked pale or unwell despite claiming initial improvement. With every passing minute, my unease grew heavier. Was my mother knowingly prolonging their pain, ensuring they remained tethered to her clinic forever? The thought alone made me feel sick. But I knew feelings weren't enough. I needed facts. So, the next morning, I met with an old university acquaintance who worked in a private laboratory. His name was Raman, and though I hesitated to burden him with the truth, His kind eyes gave me courage. I need these medicines analyzed, I told him, placing the bottles on his desk. And please keep this between us. He nodded solemnly, asking no further questions, and promised me results within days. The weight felt unbearable. At night, I lay awake staring at the ceiling, my mind trapped in an endless loop. My mother's face, the locked room, the notebook's ominous notes. I remembered the nights she had stayed by my side when I was ill as a child, her hands cool against my feverish forehead, her voice soothing me back to sleep. How could the same woman cause harm to others? When the results finally arrived, my worst fears materialized. Ramian's voice trembled as he explained. The compounds in the medicines were harmful, designed to offer temporary relief while inflicting long-term damage. Some were even banned in most countries for their toxicity. I clutched the report with trembling hands, tears blurring the words. The truth was undeniable now. My mother was not merely making mistakes. She was orchestrating something deliberate, something devastating. And I had no idea how to face her. The report lay on my desk like a verdict, each line a knife that cut deeper into the bond I had once thought unbreakable. My hands shook as I read the words again. Toxic compounds, temporary relief, long-term damage. It was no longer a matter of doubt or suspicion, it was fact. The woman I revered, the woman whose love had shaped me, was handing poison cloaked as medicine. That night, I sat opposite her at the dinner table, my throat tight, my appetite gone. She chatted lightly about her day, about the women she had treated, about how grateful they were for her help. Her eyes sparkled with the same warmth I had known all my life. And yet, behind that warmth, I now saw something else. An illusion carefully crafted to hide the truth. I wanted to blurt it out, to slam the report on the table and demand answers. But when I opened my mouth, the words froze. All I managed aside to ask was, "Are you sure the medicines are safe?" For a fraction of a second, her face stiffened. Then she smiled, brushing the question away with a gentle laugh. "Oh, Afshin, you worry too much. Every treatment has its side effects, but trust me, I know what I'm doing. You must have faith in me." Faith, the word echoed bitterly inside me. I had given her faith all my life, blindly, without question. Now that very faith felt like a betrayal of the women who placed their trust in her hands. The following days were torture. I could no longer look at the patients without guilt gnawing at me. Their smiles as they left with new prescriptions haunted me, for I knew they carried not healing but harm. I began speaking quietly to some of them, asking how they felt after their treatments. The answers were always the same. Relief at first, then unbearable pain. One woman confided through tears that she had begun fearing she might never recover. Each story added another stone to the weight pressing on my chest. At night, when I tried to sleep, I heard their voices mingled with my mother's, praising her, trusting her, loving her, completely unaware of the truth. Finally, one evening, unable to hold my silence any longer, I tried again. "Mother," I said carefully, what if the medicines you're giving aren't what you think they are? What if they're hurting people?" This time, her eyes narrowed. There was no smile, no gentle laugh. Instead, her voice turned cold. "Afshin, some decisions in life are not made by the heart, but by survival. You are too young to understand how the world works. Stop asking foolish questions." Her words landed like stones. For the first time, I realized she was not in the dark. She knew. She chose. And in that moment, my world cracked. After that night, the house felt colder, even when the lights were on and my mother's voice echoed through the rooms. Her words, "Some decisions are made by survival," played in my head like a relentless drumbeat. For the first time in my life, I no longer saw her as my guide or protector. Instead, I saw her as a woman who had chosen a path paved with the suffering of others, and that realization pierced me more deeply than any wound I had ever known. I began keeping notes of everything I observed at the clinic, patient names, their symptoms, the prescriptions given, and how frequently they returned. Each record felt like a betrayal of my mother, yet it also felt like justice for the women who placed their trust in her. My conscience whispered that silence would make me complicit, and I could not allow that stain to mark my soul. But the hardest part was facing her every day. She carried on as if nothing had changed, speaking to me with warmth in her tone, even pride in her eyes. Sometimes I wondered if she sensed what I was doing, if she knew I had begun collecting evidence. At night, I lay awake, torn between guilt and determination, replaying memories of her sacrifices for me. I thought of the nights she stayed by my side when I was sick as a child, the mornings she worked tirelessly to pay my tuition, the tenderness with which she brushed my hair before school. How could the same hands that nurtured me also sign prescriptions that poisoned other women? The answer came to me in a moment of clarity. She had chosen survival, but survival without conscience is not life. It is corruption. I could not let her legacy crush the futures of countless innocent women. I decided to act carefully. First, I gathered more samples of the drugs, ensuring I photographed each bottle and its label. I also took copies of her patient notes whenever I had the chance. My heart pounded every time I slipped a notebook into my bag, terrified that she might walk in and catch me. The thought of her discovering my betrayal filled me with dread, yet the thought of doing nothing filled me with even greater shame. The more evidence I collected, the clearer my path became. I knew I could no longer confide in her, nor could I hope to change her through words. She had chosen her course, and now I had to choose mine. One morning, while she was at prayer, I sat in my room staring at the growing pile of evidence. My hands trembled as I whispered to myself, if I stay silent, I become her accomplice. If I speak, I destroy her. But I saved them. The choice was devastating, but it was mine to make. The day I chose to leave home with the evidence in my bag, the world seemed strangely quiet, as though the air itself held its breath. My mother had already gone to the clinic, unaware of the storm gathering behind her. I walked slowly toward the police station, each step heavy, as if my body resisted the betrayal my soul demanded. Inside my bag were the notebooks I had copied, photographs of medicine bottles, and the lab report that confirmed their toxicity. Each piece of evidence felt like a shard of glass pressed against my heart. These were not just documents. They were the undoing of the woman who had raised me. But I reminded myself again and again, this was not about her. This was about the women whose lives were being destroyed. When I arrived at the station, my knees threatened to buckle. The officer at the front desk raised an eyebrow at me, perhaps surprised to see a young woman with such a grave expression. My voice shook as I said, I have something important to report. He guided me into a small office where a senior officer listened intently as I laid everything before him. As I spoke, I felt my chest tighten. I explained how my mother's treatment seemed to bring temporary relief before worsening conditions, how patients returned again and again, desperate, unaware of the trap they were caught in. Then I placed the report on the desk. The officer studied it carefully, his face darkening with every line he read. You realize what this means? He asked quietly. I nodded, though my voice cracked when I answered, yes, it means my own mother is guilty of harming the women who trusted her. There was silence for a moment. Then he leaned back, exhaling heavily. We will investigate this immediately, but you must be ready. Your testimony will be crucial. Those words struck like thunder. Testimony. I would have to stand before strangers and declare the crimes of the woman who had given me life. The thought made my throat burn with tears I could not release in front of him. I left the station and walked home through streets that felt unfamiliar. Every face I passed seemed to stare, though I knew they had no idea what burden I carried. When I reached home, my mother greeted me with her usual smile, asking if I'd eaten. I could barely look at her. I mumbled a reply and hurried to my room, where I collapsed onto my bed, clutching my chest as if to keep it from splitting apart. That night, as I listened to her moving about the house, I realized that nothing would ever be the same. I had opened the door to a truth that could not be closed again, and soon she would know it too. The knock on our door came 3 days later, sharp and unrelenting. I knew before opening my eyes that morning that the moment had arrived. From my window, I saw the police cars lined along the street, their flashing lights casting cruel reflections on our walls. Neighbors had already begun to gather, whispering, pointing. My mother stood frozen as officers stepped inside. They searched the clinic, pulled open drawers, and carried away boxes of medicine. She tried to protest at first, her voice trembling with anger and disbelief. But when they presented the report, the photographs, and the testimonies already collected, her face drained of color. Then her eyes found mine. For a moment, the entire world shrank to that single look. It was not rage, not even sorrow. It was betrayal. She understood. She knew it had been me. Her lips parted, and though she said no words, her silence pierced me like a blade. They placed her in handcuffs. As she was led past me, she whispered just one sentence, barely audible. You sold me. My knees nearly gave way. My chest felt hollow, as though my heart had been ripped from it. I wanted to scream, to tell her that I had not sold her, but had saved countless women from ruin. Yet no words came. The trial was swift, though each day in the courtroom stretched endlessly. I sat in the witness stand, trembling as I recounted what I had discovered. The notebooks, the patient's complaints, the lab results, all laid bare under the harsh light of justice. My mother sat across from me, her head bowed, her hands clenched together. She never once met my eyes. The verdict was inevitable. Guilty of malpractice, fraud, and endangerment. A sentence of years behind bars. As the judge read it, I felt no triumph, no satisfaction, only a grief so profound it nearly consumed me. Back home, the silence was unbearable. Her chair at the table remained empty, her prayer rug untouched. Everywhere I looked, memories of her lingered. The woman who had sung me to sleep, who had sacrificed everything after my father's death, who had carried the weight of 2 lives on her shoulders, yet those same hands had written prescriptions that broke other women's bodies. The neighborhood divided. Some pitied me, others shunned me. A few whispered that I was brave, but bravery felt hollow when measured against the cost. I wept often, though always in secret, because I did not want pity. I only wanted answers. And still, amid the sorrow, one truth anchored me. Silence would have been complicity. I had chosen justice, not because it was easy, but because it was necessary. Even now, I pray for her redemption. I pray she finds light in the darkness of her cell. For though she has fallen, she is still my mother. And though I turned her in, I did it with the hope that one day, both of us might be freed. From guilt, from lies, from the chains we never asked to wear. Kiyasan.